It began as a quiet whisper drifting through the corridors of Buckingham Palace, one that senior aides tried desperately to dismiss and royal insiders refused to discuss openly. But when Princess Anne abruptly canceled part of her schedule and demanded an unscheduled meeting with trusted advisors, the atmosphere changed instantly. Something serious had been uncovered, something involving Queen Camilla. And according to growing reports, it was not just another palace disagreement, it was a secret plan that threatened the balance of power inside the monarchy itself. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. For years, Princess Anne had earned a reputation as one of the monarchy's most disciplined and dependable figures. She was not known for emotional outbursts, public confrontations, or dramatic reactions. That was precisely why the sudden change in her behavior immediately attracted attention from those working closest to the royal household. Palace staff reportedly noticed an unusual tension surrounding Anne in the days leading up to the emergency consultations. Conversations became shorter. Meetings became more frequent. Long-standing routines were quietly interrupted. The normally steady rhythm of palace operations suddenly felt unsettled, as if something significant had begun unfolding behind closed doors. According to growing whispers from royal insiders, confidential documents had started circulating among a very small circle of senior advisors. Access to those materials was reportedly restricted to only a handful of trusted individuals. Even among experienced courtiers, curiosity quickly turned into concern. Nobody seemed willing to discuss what was inside the documents openly, but the secrecy surrounding them only fueled speculation. Questions spread through private offices and administrative corridors. Why were these records being reviewed now? Who had authorized the investigation? And most importantly, what connection did they have to Queen Camilla? The answers, according to several reports, began reaching Princess Anne through a series of highly confidential briefings. What she allegedly learned during those discussions transformed concern into alarm. Sources claim Anne was informed of a private strategy that could dramatically expand Camilla's influence over key palace operations in the years ahead. On the surface, the proposal may have appeared administrative, but beneath that ordinary appearance, some insiders reportedly believed it represented something far more significant. It was not simply about influence, it was about positioning. It was about shaping future decisions before anyone realized how much power had already shifted. As word of the situation slowly spread among senior royal circles, extraordinary measures were reportedly introduced to contain the discussion. Courtiers were instructed to limit internal conversations. Staff members who normally shared information across departments suddenly found themselves excluded from sensitive meetings. The atmosphere became increasingly tense. The less information people received, the more concerned they became. Silence, in many ways, became its own warning sign. Prince William was quietly brought into a series of private consultations as concerns continued to grow. Those meetings reportedly stretched across several days, involving trusted advisors and constitutional experts who rarely participated in routine palace matters. While official explanations remained absent, observers noted that William's schedule appeared unusually flexible during this period, fueling further speculation that something serious was being discussed at the highest levels of the monarchy. Then came the reports that truly intensified the controversy. Multiple insiders began claiming that Princess Anne was furious after learning the full extent of what had allegedly been uncovered. Not concerned, not disappointed. Furious, for someone known for her restraint, that reaction alone suggested the issue had crossed a line that could not easily be ignored. The question no longer centered on whether a plan existed. The question became who knew about it, who supported it, and how long it had been quietly developing beneath the surface while much of the royal family remained unaware. As those questions continued multiplying, an even more unsettling possibility began emerging. Perhaps this was not a recent development at all. Perhaps the groundwork had been laid months earlier, hidden behind routine appointments, private discussions, and carefully managed relationships that seemed harmless when viewed individually. But when placed together, they appeared to form a much larger picture, one that was only now becoming visible to those determined enough to look. But what Anne discovered was far more alarming than a simple attempt to gain influence. It traced back to a carefully constructed network of loyalty, ambition, and long-term positioning. Long before the palace became consumed by whispers of secret plans, a quieter transformation had been unfolding behind the scenes. Few noticed it at first. Fewer still questioned it. Yet over time, certain appointments, alliances, and private relationships began creating a circle of influence that appeared increasingly centered around Camilla rather than the institution itself. The more Princess Anne examined the information being placed before her, the more she became convinced that the controversy did not begin with a single document or a single meeting. According to insiders, the roots stretched much deeper. What appeared on the surface to be routine administrative changes allegedly formed part of a much broader pattern that had been developing quietly for years. Individually, none of the decisions seemed extraordinary. Together, however, they painted a picture that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Reports began circulating among royal circles that Camilla had gradually built a trusted network inside key areas of palace operations. These were not necessarily dramatic appointments that generated headlines or public attention. Instead, they were subtle shifts that unfolded over time. Advisors who shared similar perspectives appeared to gain greater access. Trusted allies found themselves occupying increasingly strategic positions. Relationships strengthened behind the scenes while the public remained focused on more visible royal matters. To outside observers, nothing seemed unusual. But within the palace, some experienced figures reportedly started noticing that influence was beginning to flow through a different set of channels. Among those paying close attention was Princess Anne. Unlike many who focused on short-term controversies, Anne had spent decades observing how power moved through the institution. She understood that major changes rarely arrived suddenly. They developed gradually, often hidden beneath ordinary decisions that attracted little scrutiny. According to sources familiar with the situation, Anne had been monitoring these developments for months. At first, she reportedly treated them as routine palace politics. Every royal household experienced internal alliances and competing interests. But over time, the pattern allegedly became too consistent to dismiss. At the same moment these concerns were growing, another factor was adding uncertainty to the royal landscape. King Charles's ongoing health struggles had forced many within the monarchy to think about the future more seriously than ever before. Questions that once seemed distant suddenly felt urgent. Who would guide the institution through its next chapter? Which voices would carry the greatest influence? And what would happen if key decisions needed to be made during periods of instability? Those questions created an environment where influence became more valuable than ever. It was within that atmosphere of uncertainty that concerns about shifting power structures reportedly intensified. Some insiders feared that traditional balances inside the monarchy were quietly changing. Long-standing systems that had operated for decades appeared to be evolving in ways that made certain figures more influential while reducing the authority of others. Supporters dismissed such concerns as natural modernization. Critics saw something very different. They believed a deliberate effort was underway to shape the future before anyone fully understood what was happening. As Anne continued connecting pieces of information from different sources, a troubling possibility allegedly began emerging. What if the appointments, alliances, and growing network of loyal supporters were not isolated developments at all? What if they were part of a much larger strategy designed to secure influence far beyond the present moment? That possibility transformed private concern into genuine alarm. Suddenly, discussions that once seemed speculative started carrying far greater weight. The rumors became impossible to ignore. Whispers spread through senior royal circles that larger ambitions might be taking shape behind closed doors. No one seemed willing to describe those ambitions openly. Yet the same warning surfaced repeatedly from different directions. Something bigger was developing. Something carefully planned. Something that extended far beyond ordinary palace politics. And as Princess Anne moved deeper into her investigation, she reportedly began realizing that the answers she was seeking might reveal a struggle over the monarchy's future unlike anything she had anticipated. At first, these developments seemed harmless, but then evidence allegedly surfaced suggesting the influence campaign had a far more ambitious objective. The revelation did not arrive through a dramatic leak or public scandal. Instead, it reportedly appeared inside a collection of private briefings that landed on the desks of senior royal figures. What those papers allegedly outlined sent shockwaves through palace circles and transformed concern into outright alarm. By the time those confidential briefings reached Princess Anne, months of quiet suspicion had already begun hardening into something far more serious. The rumors that had once seemed vague and impossible to verify were now being examined through documents, reports, and internal assessments that reportedly connected pieces of a much larger puzzle. According to insiders, Anne approached the information with her usual discipline. She was not interested in gossip. She was not interested in personal feuds. She wanted evidence. And if reports are accurate, what she found inside those briefings left her deeply troubled. Sources familiar with the situation claim the documents contained sensitive internal information regarding future planning discussions that had never been intended for broad circulation. While details allegedly remain tightly restricted, several reports suggest the material focused on how influence inside the monarchy could evolve in the years ahead. At the center of those concerns were alleged proposals that appeared to expand the authority of individuals closely connected to Camilla's circle. To some observers, the plans may have seemed practical. To others, they represented a significant shift in how power could be exercised within the institution. As Anne continued reviewing the material, the implications reportedly became increasingly difficult to ignore. According to several royal insiders, discussions outlined within the briefings went beyond routine administrative matters and ventured into questions about future palace operations after King Charles. That possibility immediately raised concerns. Charles remained the reigning monarch, but his ongoing health challenges had already created uncertainty about what the future might hold. Any effort to shape structures beyond his reign carried enormous significance. Suddenly, what had appeared to be ordinary planning began looking far more consequential. The deeper Anne looked, the more one question seemed to surface repeatedly. Who would hold influence when critical decisions needed to be made? Reports suggest that some of the discussions centered on authority over key areas of palace management, strategic communications, and advisory networks. None of these subjects attracted public attention on their own. Yet those who understood the machinery of the monarchy knew how powerful such positions could become. Influence did not always come from titles. Sometimes it came from controlling information, guiding decisions, and shaping conversations before they reached the people formally responsible for making them. As concerns intensified, Prince William was reportedly brought into the discussion. Sources claim he received private briefings outlining many of the same issues that had alarmed Anne. For William, the situation allegedly carried particular significance. As heir to the throne, any long-term changes to palace structures could directly affect the future environment in which he would one day lead the monarchy. Reports suggest he listened carefully, asked difficult questions, and sought clarity on whether the concerns represented genuine risks or merely exaggerated fears. The answers he received reportedly did little to ease the growing unease. Meanwhile, senior courtiers found themselves increasingly divided. Some believed the concerns were being overstated, and argued that planning for future stability was both necessary and responsible. Others reportedly viewed the situation through a far more cautious lens. They feared that influence was gradually being consolidated in ways that could reshape decision-making processes for years to come. Conversations became tense. Trusted relationships grew strained. What had started as quiet uncertainty was evolving into a serious internal dispute over the monarchy's future direction. For Princess Anne, however, the debate eventually reached a turning point. According to insiders, there came a moment when she stopped viewing the matter as a collection of troubling possibilities and began seeing it as a challenge that demanded action. The evidence may not have answered every question, but it had answered enough. The concerns were too significant, the stakes were too high, and the potential consequences were too profound to simply dismiss and hope would disappear. What made the situation especially alarming was the growing realization that every new answer seemed to reveal another layer beneath it. The more Anne learned, the clearer it became that this was not a temporary disagreement or a passing controversy. It was a developing struggle over influence, authority, and the future shape of the institution itself. And as the divisions widened behind closed doors, Anne reportedly reached a conclusion that would define everything that followed. For Anne, the issue was no longer about personalities or palace politics. It had become a battle over the future direction of the crown itself. Those who know Princess Anne often describe her as patient, disciplined, and relentless. She rarely acts in haste, but once convinced that a threat exists, she moves with remarkable precision. According to palace whispers, that moment had finally arrived. The realization that the concerns surrounding Camilla's growing influence could no longer be ignored marked a turning point inside the royal household. For months, Anne had watched quietly. She had listened, observed, and gathered information without drawing attention to her concerns. But now, according to insiders, observation was giving way to action. The questions that had once lingered in the background were becoming impossible to dismiss, and Anne reportedly understood that waiting any longer could allow developments to move beyond anyone's control. The situation had reached a stage where caution alone was no longer enough. Reports suggest that one of Anne's first moves was to begin consulting a small circle of trusted constitutional advisors. These were individuals known not for political loyalty but for their understanding of royal traditions, succession principles, and the institutional foundations that had guided the monarchy through generations of crisis. According to palace sources, discussions focused not on personalities but on structure. What protections already existed? Which safeguards remained effective? And perhaps most importantly, what vulnerabilities could emerge if influence continued shifting in the direction outlined within the confidential briefings? The answers reportedly reinforced many of Anne's existing concerns. At the same time, private meetings were allegedly taking place between Anne, Prince William, and several senior officials. Unlike routine palace consultations, these conversations carried a different weight. Insiders claim the atmosphere was serious, focused, and increasingly urgent. The discussions were no longer centered on speculation. They were centered on preparation. If the reports reaching Anne and William proved accurate, the monarchy could soon face decisions that would shape its future for decades. Every possibility had to be examined. Every consequence had to be considered. What united those involved was a growing determination to protect the traditional structures that had long defined the crown. According to several insiders, Anne viewed the issue as larger than any individual royal. In her eyes, the monarchy survived because it followed clear principles that stood above personal ambition. Those principles had endured wars, scandals, abdications, and public criticism. Altering them, even gradually, carried risks that could not be fully measured until it was too late. The more Anne reflected on the information before her, the more determined she reportedly became to ensure that those foundations remained intact. As word of these consultations spread through palace corridors, insiders began describing an atmosphere unlike anything they had witnessed in years. Conversations became guarded. Long-standing assumptions were questioned. Senior figures who had once remained neutral reportedly found themselves choosing sides. There was no public conflict, no official announcement. Yet beneath the surface, the sense of urgency was unmistakable. Something important was happening, and those closest to the institution knew it. Part of Anne's strategy reportedly involved reviewing long-standing protocols that had governed royal operations for decades. According to sources, procedures that were rarely discussed outside constitutional circles suddenly received renewed attention. Existing safeguards were examined. Historical precedents were revisited. Rules that many assumed would never be tested again were quietly reinforced. It was not a dramatic counterattack. It was something far more characteristic of Anne's approach: careful, methodical, and extraordinarily difficult to challenge once set in motion. As these efforts expanded, key figures inside the royal establishment reportedly began rallying around Anne's position. Some were motivated by loyalty to tradition. Others were driven by concerns about stability. Whatever their reasons, a growing number of influential voices allegedly shared the belief that the situation required close attention. Support for Anne's efforts gradually strengthened, creating a network of resistance that became increasingly difficult to overlook. Eventually, reports suggest that Camilla's camp became aware that resistance was forming. The quiet confidence that had reportedly surrounded earlier developments began giving way to uncertainty. Questions emerged about who was involved, how much they knew, and what actions might come next. Suddenly, both sides understood that the conflict was no longer unfolding in isolation. It had become a contest of influence, strategy, and endurance. And as the divide widened, one unavoidable reality began drawing everyone's attention. Yet the more Anne pushed back, the more attention focused on the one person caught directly between both sides of the growing conflict. At the center of the storm stood King Charles, a husband, a monarch, and increasingly a man forced to balance personal loyalty against institutional responsibility. As tensions escalated, insiders claimed the pressure on the king became impossible to ignore. As resistance to the alleged influence campaign continued growing behind palace walls, attention inevitably shifted toward the one figure whose decision could alter everything. King Charles found himself standing at the intersection of competing loyalties, conflicting advice, and rising expectations. What had begun as a quiet concern shared among a handful of senior figures had now evolved into a challenge that touched the very heart of the monarchy. According to palace insiders, the burden on the king became heavier with each passing week, as trusted voices from every direction urged him toward dramatically different conclusions. Reports suggest Charles was receiving competing advice from multiple factions within the royal household. Some advisors reportedly urged caution, warning that overreaction could create unnecessary division during an already sensitive period. Others allegedly argued that ignoring the concerns raised by Anne and William could allow deeper problems to take root. Every conversation seemed to carry its own urgency. Every recommendation came wrapped in warnings about potential consequences. And at the center of those discussions sat a monarch already facing personal challenges that would have tested even the strongest leader. The issue was no longer confined to questions about individual influence. It had expanded into a broader debate regarding the future governance of the palace itself. According to insiders, concerns surrounding future leadership structures were becoming increasingly difficult to separate from ongoing discussions about Charles's health and the monarchy's long-term stability. What arrangements would define the institution in the years ahead? Who would shape critical decisions? And what safeguards would ensure that power remained balanced during periods of transition? These questions reportedly dominated private conversations among senior figures. Princess Anne remained one of the strongest voices advocating for caution and preservation. Sources claim she repeatedly emphasized the importance of protecting the traditions and constitutional principles that had guided the monarchy for generations. To Anne, the issue was never about personal rivalries. It was about ensuring that the institution remained larger than any individual figure. According to those familiar with her position, she believed that once long-standing structures were weakened, restoring them could become nearly impossible. Her warnings carried weight because they came from decades of experience and an unwavering commitment to duty. On the opposite side of the debate, supporters of Camilla reportedly pushed back against the growing criticism. They argued that many of the concerns were being exaggerated and unfairly interpreted. According to insiders, they viewed Camilla's role as both legitimate and necessary, particularly during a period of uncertainty surrounding the king's health. They defended her intentions, questioned the assumptions being made by critics, and insisted that many of the alleged developments reflected practical planning rather than an attempt to reshape the monarchy's balance of power. The divide between both camps continued widening. Amid this increasingly tense atmosphere, Prince William reportedly found himself aligning more closely with Anne's concerns. While careful not to escalate the conflict publicly, insiders claim William became increasingly convinced that the issues being raised deserved serious attention. As future king, he allegedly understood that decisions made during this period could affect not only Charles's reign, but also the environment he would eventually inherit. That realization reportedly strengthened his determination to support efforts aimed at protecting institutional stability. The deeper the discussions became, the harder it was to contain the disagreements. What had once remained hidden within private meetings began influencing relationships throughout the royal household. Long-standing alliances faced new pressures. Trusted advisors found themselves navigating increasingly sensitive conversations. Even those who preferred to remain neutral reportedly struggled to avoid becoming entangled in the growing conflict. The atmosphere became charged with uncertainty, as if everyone understood that a decisive moment was approaching, but no one knew exactly when it would arrive. As the pressure mounted, one question began overshadowing every other concern. What would King Charles ultimately decide? Would he side with those urging restraint and continuity? Would he support those defending Camilla's position? Or would he attempt to find a compromise between two increasingly incompatible visions for the future? According to insiders, even those closest to the king could not confidently predict his next move. And that uncertainty only intensified the tension spreading through every corner of the palace. Because while advisors debated, alliances shifted, and suspicions deepened. Events were already gaining a momentum that no private discussion could fully control. The conflict had reached a stage where silence was no longer enough. Decisions would soon have to be made. Positions would have to be declared. And the consequences of those choices would ripple far beyond the individuals directly involved. As the palace waited for the king's response, events were already moving beyond private discussions and toward a confrontation neither side could avoid. What began as a confidential dispute soon evolved into something far larger. Conversations that once occurred behind closed doors started influencing relationships throughout the royal household. Lines were being drawn, alliances were forming, and neutrality was becoming increasingly difficult. The conflict had now reached a stage where it could no longer be contained within private meetings and carefully guarded briefings. What started as whispered concerns among a small group of senior figures was gradually spreading throughout the wider royal household. According to insiders, people who had once viewed the situation as a distant internal disagreement suddenly found themselves affected by it. The atmosphere inside the palace reportedly changed in subtle but unmistakable ways. Conversations became more cautious. Long-standing friendships grew strained. Trust became harder to give and easier to question. Without any official declaration, a divide was beginning to take shape. Reports suggest that staff members, advisors, and senior figures quietly started gravitating toward opposing positions. Some aligned themselves with Princess Anne's growing campaign to preserve what they viewed as essential institutional safeguards. Others sympathized with those defending Camilla's role and the arguments being made by her supporters. Few openly declared where they stood, but according to palace whispers, preferences became increasingly clear through private conversations, strategic meetings, and shifting alliances. What made the situation especially uncomfortable was that many of those involved had worked alongside one another for years. The growing tension was not simply professional, it was personal. Those rallying around Anne reportedly framed the issue in terms of duty, continuity, and responsibility. According to insiders, they believed the monarchy's survival depended upon maintaining structures that placed the institution above individual ambitions. For them, the concerns were not rooted in hostility toward any particular person. Instead, they centered on protecting the balance that had allowed the crown to endure through countless periods of uncertainty. Every decision, every protocol, and every safeguard existed for a reason. Weakening those foundations, they feared, could create consequences that would not become visible until much later. On the other side, Camilla's supporters reportedly saw the situation very differently. Sources claim they viewed many of Anne's concerns as resistance to inevitable change. In their eyes, the monarchy could not remain frozen in time. It had to adapt, evolve, and respond to modern realities. They argued that continuity required flexibility, and that trusted figures around Camilla were helping ensure stability during a challenging period for the royal family. To them, accusations of excessive influence were exaggerated interpretations of practical planning. The more criticism intensified, the more determined they became to defend their position. As both perspectives gained support, uncertainty reportedly began affecting daily palace operations. Decision-making became slower. Routine discussions carried additional layers of caution. Officials found themselves navigating an environment where even ordinary conversations could be interpreted through the lens of the growing dispute. According to insiders, the tension was no longer limited to those directly involved. It was influencing the broader culture of the institution itself. Everyone seemed aware that something significant was unfolding, even if few fully understood its scope. Beyond palace walls, signs of unusual activity were also beginning to attract attention. Media insiders reportedly noticed changes in scheduling patterns, unexpected consultations, and an increase in confidential discussions among senior royal figures. Journalists who regularly monitored royal affairs sensed that something important was happening beneath the surface. While concrete details remained elusive, speculation started building. Questions multiplied. Curiosity intensified. The story was no longer confined to private corridors. Then came the leaks. Not dramatic revelations, but fragments of information that slowly found their way into public conversation. A rumor here, a reported disagreement there. None of it provided a complete picture, yet together they created an atmosphere of growing intrigue. Public fascination intensified as commentators attempted to connect the dots. The more people searched for answers, the more attention focused on the monarchy's internal dynamics. What had once been hidden now seemed increasingly visible. According to palace sources, this growing scrutiny created new pressures for everyone involved. The conflict was becoming impossible to completely hide. Every attempt to contain the narrative seemed only to generate additional questions. Every effort to dismiss concerns appeared to fuel further speculation. The dispute had outgrown its original boundaries and was now moving toward a stage where larger decisions could no longer be postponed. Yet despite the competing arguments, shifting alliances, and rising public curiosity, Princess Anne reportedly remained focused on something she believed mattered more than personal loyalties: public perception, or political victories. In her mind, the real issue had never changed, and as events continued accelerating around her, that conviction only became stronger. But while factions argued over influence and authority, Anne remained focused on one objective that she believed outweighed every personal relationship involved. For Princess Anne, this was never merely about Camilla. It was about preserving what she believed generations had worked to protect. The stakes, in her view, extended beyond individual ambitions and reached directly into the monarchy's future identity. As the conflict intensified and speculation continued spreading throughout royal circles, Anne's position reportedly became clearer than ever. According to insiders, she no longer viewed the situation as a temporary dispute that could be resolved through compromise alone. In her mind, the questions now facing the monarchy touched something much deeper. They involved the principles upon which the institution had survived for centuries. While others focused on personalities, influence, and competing interests, Anne allegedly remained fixed on a larger concern. She believed the monarchy's greatest strength had always been its ability to place duty above personal advantage, and she feared that principle was being tested in ways few fully understood. Sources claim Anne increasingly framed the dispute as a matter of responsibility rather than rivalry. Those familiar with her thinking suggest she repeatedly emphasized that the crown could not be governed by short-term considerations or shifting loyalties. The institution had endured because each generation accepted certain obligations, even when doing so required sacrifice. According to palace whispers, Anne believed that preserving those traditions was not simply important, it was essential. If those foundations weakened, the consequences might not become visible immediately, but they would eventually shape the future of the monarchy itself. This perspective reportedly led Anne and her supporters to examine historical precedents with renewed attention. Past constitutional challenges, succession questions, and moments of royal uncertainty were quietly revisited. According to insiders, these discussions were not driven by nostalgia. They were driven by a search for guidance. History, Anne allegedly argued, offered valuable lessons about what happened when institutions lost sight of their core purpose. The more those precedents were studied, the more determined she became to ensure that present decisions reflected the wisdom gained from previous generations. At the same time, Prince William was increasingly viewed as Anne's strongest ally in the growing struggle. Reports suggest that his involvement had evolved significantly since the first confidential briefings. What began as cautious concern reportedly developed into active engagement. As heir to the throne, William allegedly recognized that the outcome of this conflict could influence the monarchy long after the current controversy faded. Sources claim he shared Anne's belief that protecting institutional stability required difficult conversations and decisive action. Together, they became the central figures behind efforts to address the concerns that had triggered the crisis. Behind closed doors, senior royal figures reportedly spent countless hours discussing the potential long-term consequences. The conversations extended far beyond immediate tensions. According to insiders, questions focused on what kind of monarchy future generations would inherit. Would traditional safeguards remain intact? Would decision-making structures continue functioning as intended? And would public confidence survive if internal disputes appeared to overshadow the institution's broader mission? These concerns added urgency to every discussion, creating a sense that time was slowly running out. As the weeks passed, pressure reportedly mounted for some form of decisive resolution. Neutrality became increasingly difficult to maintain. Advisors who once preferred caution found themselves acknowledging that uncertainty could not continue indefinitely. Every day without clarity seemed to deepen divisions and encourage further speculation. The demand for answers grew stronger both inside and outside palace walls. According to insiders, many believed that a defining moment was approaching whether anyone was fully prepared for it or not. At the center of these discussions remained the question that had haunted the conflict from the beginning. What would become of Camilla's future influence? Supporters insisted she remained an important and respected figure whose contributions should not be overlooked. Critics argued that unresolved concerns required stronger safeguards moving forward. Neither side appeared willing to abandon its position. The debate continued, growing more intense, drawing greater attention with each passing day. Meanwhile, palace insiders reportedly began anticipating what many described as a defining outcome. Some believed the confrontation would ultimately strengthen existing structures. Others feared it could expose deeper divisions than anyone had imagined. Regardless of where they stood, few doubted that the monarchy was approaching a crucial crossroads. The tension that had once existed only in whispers now hung over every conversation, every consultation, and every decision. And as the final discussions approached, many believed the monarchy stood on the edge of a turning point that could reshape royal dynamics for years to come. In the end, the controversy surrounding Camilla's alleged plan became about something larger than any single royal figure. It exposed anxieties, ambitions, loyalties, and fears that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. But most of all, it revealed how fiercely Princess Anne was willing to fight for the institution she has spent her life serving. As the final phase of the controversy unfolded, many within royal circles reportedly began recognizing that the conflict had already changed the palace in ways that could not easily be reversed. What started as a series of private concerns about influence and authority had evolved into a defining test of priorities, values, and leadership. The dispute may have centered on Camilla's alleged plans, but according to insiders, the deeper impact was felt in how people viewed the monarchy itself. Long-standing assumptions were challenged. Hidden tensions were exposed. Questions that had remained dormant for years were suddenly impossible to ignore. One of the clearest outcomes was the way perceptions shifted inside the royal household. According to palace sources, figures who had once remained distant from institutional debates found themselves thinking differently about the future. The controversy forced many to consider where they stood on issues of tradition, succession, and responsibility. It also revealed just how fragile internal unity could become when competing visions for the monarchy's future collided. The palace that emerged from the conflict was not necessarily divided, but it was certainly more aware of the challenges that lay ahead. Because while power inside the palace may shift from one generation to the next, the struggle between personal ambition and royal duty never truly disappears, and according to those closest to the crown, this battle may have only been the beginning. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.